Oh.
Grant, thanks for joining me again. It's always a pleasure. Some interesting new updates here. We got Eric Davis and Hal Putoff on Coast to Coast with George Knapp. I didn't know this, but they said that they both work for the AATIP program. Did I get that right? Did Hal Putoff work on the AATIP program?
Yeah, they were subcontractors. Bob Bigelow won the contract for the AATIP program from the Department of Navy Intelligence, and Hal and Eric Davis were one of the subcontractors on the program. And as Eric pointed out, they had these 38 reports on different types of propulsion systems and stuff like that. All sorts of theoretical type stuff. So they were doing these kind of things. But both of them have known Bigelow for a long time because both of them were part of NDEs. Because as you know, that Bob Bigelow formed the NDEs organization. And what he would do there, he would bring in all the key guys because he had the money. He was very interested in figuring out what was going on. So he would bring in people like Hal Putoff was one of his key people. Eric Davis was the chief scientist for NDEs. And I talked to him the first time I met Eric Davis was just when Hal Putoff was shutting NDEs down. Eric was still in Las Vegas, and he had just been laid off as they were shutting the program down. And that's when I met Eric Davis, and he told me a lot of stuff, how the thing worked and what they were trying to do. So they've been with him for a number of years, and that's what you always got to remember in these stories. Whether it's this story or whether it's the Tom DeLonge story or whatever, that a lot of the players are the same players that were there right from the word go. Bill Moore. So the Bill Moore operation starts in 1980. You have John Alexander. You have Hal Putoff. You have Kit Green. And then you go to John Alexander's group. Then you have Hal Putoff, Kit Green, John Alexander. Then you go to the NDEs group. You have Hal Putoff, Kit Green, John Alexander. John Alexander was running sort of the head of the NDEs meetings or whatever. And now you have the Tom DeLonge group, and you have Hal Putoff, Kit Green, John Alexander, and Eric Davis is sort of like a minor player, but it's the same players. And what it is a bunch of guys that are trying to figure out what's going on themselves. This is my impression, that at some point in their career, whether they were intelligence or scientific or military or whatever, at some point in their career, they ran up against the UFO phenomena. They did a little bit of work on it, and they got, like you and I, they got down the rabbit hole, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. Then through these different types of groups, whether it was the NDEs group or whether it was Joe Firmage's ISSO group or any of these groups where they sort of met up, they basically, what happens is that they all find out that somebody's got money, somebody's got running a program, and they immediately volunteer and they get into the program because, number one, you want to interact with people who are knowledgeable about the subject, so the other people who know what's going on. And if you're trying to, like Hal Putoff and Eric Davis, if you're trying to develop propulsion system behind UFOs, you want to get to where the money is and where the people have the expertise. So these guys have been around for decades and decades, and it's the same players. And so, yes, these two guys, they're at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, and Eric has been with Hal Putoff for, I believe, 13 years, I think he said. And they're basically working on these leading edge propulsions, ideas of wormholes and just that leading edge stuff. And so when you're in that kind of situation, you need contracts, whether it's from the government, whether it's from Bigelow, or just to try to work on whatever you're working on. And they did get lucky enough to be subcontractors on the AATIP program.
That's amazing. What haven't these guys been involved in? They've been involved in all the remote viewing, the UFO working group. Incredible. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in one of those meetings.
That's right. And what you got to remember, like, one of the things that you can sort of point out that in this discussion, and I really didn't realize this, although Eric may have told me this when I met him many, many years ago. He may have told me this story, but like Jim Semivan or like Bledsoe, like myself, like a number of people, they get in it because they've had a sighting. And if you recall back with the interview that George Knapp did with Eric Davis and with Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis mentions the fact that he has this daylight sighting with his wife when he's graduating with his PhD. I think it's 1989 as his daylight sighting, and he goes down the rabbit hole. And almost like when I had my sighting in May of 1975, it sort of just changes your life. You go like, wow, I mean, I can't believe, this has happened. You get intrigued. You try to figure out, what did I see? What's going on? And he had this experience, and Hal Puthoff doesn't mention that, because I think and Knapp asked him about, why he's interested, and he sort of says, well, it started a long time ago, or he mentions a little bit of the work he did with NSA and all this kind of stuff. But there's an interview that a lot of people won't have seen. There was an interview that was done with Dan Smith, who's sort of the spokesman for Ron Pandolfi, and he has a conversation with Jack Sarfati. And I recommend people, if they want to see a real interesting conversation, all you have to do is Google search Jack Sarfati and Dan Smith, and you'll see a series of interviews that they did together in a number of years ago, maybe at least a decade ago, in San Francisco. And it's at that point that Jack Sarfati tells where Hal Puthoff's interest may have come from. And if you know the story with Jack Sarfati, he has this very bizarre experience when he's about 12 years old in 1953, where he gets a phone call from a voice. It sounds like Stephen Hawking's voice, sort of a cold, metallic voice. And the voice says, "Is this Jack?" And he said, "Yeah, this is Jack." And he said, "Well, this is a voice. This is a computer on board a flying saucer." And Jack thinks it's kind of a scam. He thinks it's one of his buddies pulling this thing. And he tells this very bizarre story about getting all these phone calls. And according to his mother, he got a number of these phone calls. And the voice had said, when you have to agree to this, we have 400 people that we've chosen, young, brilliant minds that we want to pass our knowledge onto. And we would like you to participate in this, but you have to agree to it. And Jack said, "Oh, okay, yeah, whatever, I'll agree to it." And he gets this sort of a shock up his spine, which is like a Kundalini type experience. And he sort of gets, at that point, he sort of becomes intrigued with the thing. And the voice tells him, in 20 years, we'll start to introduce you to the rest of the 400 people. And 20 years later, so it's 1972, 1973, he suddenly reads an article he's in California, he's about to go to England to get a job lecturing at London University, and he sees this article about Uri Geller appearing at SRI. And he thinks, this is intriguing, I should check into this before I go. It's only a couple of days before he goes to London. He phones up SRI, and that's where Hal Puthoff is running the remote viewing program, and it's financed by the CIA. And Uri Geller is one of their subjects, and Ingo Swann is one of the subjects, and Russell Targ is one of the guys running the program. And the guy who picks up the phone, he's now dead, but he was one of the people in the program. Jack Sarfati said, "Well, I'm kind of interested in this Uri Geller coming to your program." And he says, the guy says, "Oh, Dr. Sarfati, we've been expecting your call." And he went, "What? You've been expecting my call?" And this is this synchronicity type thing, where it's sort of like all these 400 people are being linked together. But the key to this whole story is that when he makes the phone call, he's phoning Hal Puthoff. And Hal Puthoff may be one of the 400. So during this conversation, if you look up these conversations between Dan Smith and Jack Sarfati, which are absolutely fascinating, Jack Sarfati says at one point he asked Hal Puthoff, and appeared, although Hal didn't go into details, that he had some sort of similar experience when he was young. So that's the thing to keep in mind, that a lot of the people that are playing this game, and sometimes people will rate them as, these evil government guys who are, trying to destroy the world and stuff like this. And in a lot of cases, they're just guys like me who had an experience, who had, they went down the rabbit hole, they saw something, they experienced something, they heard something, and they became intrigued with the story, and that's why they're chasing the story.
That was my next question. I think it's really amazing that you listen to what Eric Davis said. He said he saw a sighting, and then years later he was in Vegas. Then he sees the article, the advertisement for National Institute for Discovery Science. He goes, "Oh, I got to look into that, and then he starts working for Bigelow. So if he hadn't seen that UFO, he wouldn't have been interested. He would have never been, all those groups. He wouldn't be where he is today, probably, right? So almost that this whole thing is almost orchestrated, and we're almost kind of being led down this road,
Yeah, and my synchronicity with Eric was that I happened to be in Las Vegas at exactly the same time that he was being, he was laid off. He didn't have a job. He then got a job, sort of a contract with the Air Force, working for the Air Force, some project. But it was at that point when he sort of explained what NIDS was. And I wasn't hearing it from, sort of like an article or whatever. I was hearing it from the inside. And he was basically telling me, who was there and the fact that this was a very serious sort of operation and all these people were brought in and that, Bigelow had a lot of money and that he was sort of picking the brains of these very, very smart people. And so I knew from the 1980s being involved with Bill Moore that this was almost exactly the same type of operation that these guys had reassembled under another, organization. First they were, with Bill Moore, because Bill Moore had his contacts, and then John Alexander ran the group in the 1980s, and they all, joined up there to see what they could learn. And then Bob Bigelow has it. They all join up and find out what, they got Bob Bigelow's money. They're talking to each other. Then in 1999, Joe Firmage starts ISSO, and he's got a pile of money. Yeah, he quits from this $3 billion company he started, and he's going to do the UFO thing and, anti-gravity and all this kind of stuff. They jump in there. And so when you see the Tom DeLonge thing come along, you suddenly realize, this is the same story. It's like people think the Tom DeLonge is something new and it's something original. It's not the first rodeo. Let me guarantee you, this has been done over and over again. And it's basically the same players who are, in a lot of cases, experiencers. And there may be, as you pointed out, a lot of synchronicity behind what's actually going on here, that maybe some of the stuff is orchestrated from someplace else.
It's really neat. And also, too, Hal said he saw leaked documents that talked about a crash disk, and he thinks that there might be other materials out there. And then he talked about seeing top secret documents about the Russians being into this. Like, that was quite revealing, I thought.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised at that. And I asked, I've been in contact with John Greenwald, because I did a lot of FOIA material many years ago. I've actually filed an FOIA on this whole operation, but it's a different FOIA than everybody else is doing. Everybody else is trying to get the documents and the video and all this kind of stuff. And basically my FOIA is going to be on how many FOIAs there was, who's filing FOIAs on this, how many requests have they got, what are people asking for? Because a lot of people that will file the FOIAs will give details that you and I won't hear, and they're trying to give details to so I filed an FOIA. So I'm talking to John Greenwald, who was actually on The Dark Journalist. It's kind of interesting. If you watch 2 weeks ago, John Greenwald, who's filed 8,000 FOIAs, and he's working on this, and he's kind of the expert on FOIAs. I haven't done many for years, and I was never the expert, but he's become the expert. He started this when he was like 15 years old. I remember him when he was about 15 years old contacting me about doing FOIAs and stuff like that. And he sort of went on with it. So he's filed FOIAs, and he's not getting anywhere. This is something that people have to sort of realize. Everybody thinks that the government has sort of agreed to this, and they've acknowledged that these films are real and the documents and the group and stuff like that. But John Greenwald's filed FOIAs. I have a reporter who filed an FOIA. There was a British newspaper who filed an FOIA. Robert Powell, who has been working on this for a couple of years, filed FOIAs. And nobody's gotten anything to confirm anything. The government's playing the same old game. What documents? What are you talking about? What group? We don't have any records. And they're playing this same stupid game, not really acknowledging. So the story's floating around, but there really is no 100% acknowledgement. So that's where the FOIA thing comes in. And what was interesting when Hal mentioned this, I was talking to John, and we were having this discussion. We're actually going to do an interview between John and I. We're going to discuss this actual aspect. And John was very suspicious of the fact that Hal had confirmed that there was a legitimate crash saucer document that had leaked, because that was a surprise to me. And I went to John Burroughs. I went to Linda Howe, who were in contact with Eric Davis. I said, have you heard about this document? What document is he talking about? what document can we say that's actually legitimate? Because that's a significant thing. If there is a legitimate crash saucer document that he and Davis and whoever checked this out and confirms that this is a legitimate document, then we've got a live story. But he didn't identify the document. John Greenwald was a little suspicious that he would talk about this. And the other thing you mentioned that John and I talked about was this idea that Hal had said that he saw detailed classified documents on the Russian UFO program, which is quite significant. And if you remember when he was asked a question, he was a long sort of pause on both questions, especially the one about the crash saucer stuff. There's a long pause, and the confirmation by Hal Puthoff that he has read highly classified, or not highly classified, but detailed classified documents about the Russian program indicates there are documents, detailed classified documents on the Russian program that we haven't seen, that he's basically confirming. So I was very surprised that he talked about that, because that would seem to be something that you probably shouldn't be talking about. I mean, if this is still classified, still held by the government, you really shouldn't be talking about it. So those are two aspects that we are looking at. John is looking at it. I brought it up to him. I brought it up to, Linda and John, and maybe Hal will clarify this down the road, or maybe this is part of, some sort of revelation or something. But you picked up the same thing I did. It was very significant that he talked about these things that indicate that there's more than just the thing. Because the way the story is now, everybody's saying, we're not saying aliens, we're not saying we have crash stuff or anything like that. We just have these unknowns that we've got these films and we're trying to figure this thing out. The mention of those two documents indicates that they know a little bit more than just we've got some unknowns that we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, it seems like George Knapp kind of pushed it in that direction, and then you got that big pause after he asked that question. So it almost seems to me like there might be two different groups inside the U.S. government in these agencies, ones that are pro-disclosure and ones that are anti-disclosure. Do you see it that way? Do you think that there is this big schism going on there?
Absolutely. That we've known that. I think that's pretty standard fare, not just in UFOs, but in everything else. I mean, you could take a look at, the president makes a speech, and you talk to both parties in the House and the Senate, and it's like they heard two different speeches. I mean, there's all sorts of competing people and groups and people who have a vested interest in protecting their industry, their business, their idea, or whatever. And that was part of the thing that was clearly detailed. I believe there's a couple of people that mentioned it. Scott Jones, who was the guy who helped Rockefeller brief Clinton science advisor on UFOs. I knew him, and he used to talk about this. He was involved in the remote viewing type stuff, and he stated that clearly to him, one of the reasons to shut the remote viewing program down was that there were people, and I think George Knapp has mentioned this, other people have mentioned this, that there were very religious people inside the CIA and at high levels of government who believed that this was demonic, and that if you got into this remote viewing, you were going to allow these demonic forces into the world, and they helped shut this thing down. So that's what people have to realize. It's not a uniform government where everybody thinks the same thing. You have inside the CIA, inside intelligence agencies, all sorts of people with all sorts of various beliefs. And if you're not sort of read in on the entire program, you have these competing people who may not really even know what's going on themselves, who are fighting about protecting things. And you got to remember that, and especially when it comes to business, where you have, Bob Bigelow's an interview that Bob Bigelow did, which sort of identifies these competing interests. And it was a fascinating interview. What I did is I recovered all Bob Bigelow's interviews from the last 11 years to go back and listen to what he said. And when you listen to these interviews again, you suddenly, oh my goodness, he's actually telling you what's going on, but you don't realize it until after the story's out. And in one of the interviews, he's talking about the fact that the American government, or that he's using Soviet rockets to launch his satellites into outer space. And he's doing an interview with Art Bell. And so he says, so Art says, well, why using Russian? They're SS-18 that they used to, these were the big missiles that would carry the multiple warheads to, take out the United States and their missiles and all this kind of stuff. And he said, well, they're selling these things. and we didn't have any American ones to use. And he actually tells a story that they agreed to buy the first one from the Soviets, and that was the one that was destined for Las Vegas. And they actually took the warhead off. And Bigelow said this wasn't a joke. They actually took the warhead off, the one that was destined for Las Vegas, sold it to Bigelow, and he launched some of his satellite stuff, his outer space stuff, on these rockets. So of course Art Bell says, well, why would they do this? And he said, well, when they negotiated to get rid of all the reduce the number of anti-ballistic missile units, they had to disassemble a lot of rockets because you had too many, so they had to, cut them down, and that the Russians were selling them. So Art said, well, why didn't you use an American? Americans, had a lot of rockets they had to, take out of service. And he said, well, you don't realize it's how it works. This is American industry, and that Boeing and Lockheed and people like this are building new rockets. And they don't want used rockets on the marketplace because it's going to put them out of business. And they want to sell new rockets. And so the Russians are selling rockets. The Americans are basically using Russian rockets to launch their stuff. And in the United States, he said, well, what did the Americans do? And he said, well, basically they took bulldozers over these perfectly brand new operational rockets and took them out of commission so that you wouldn't have rockets at 10 cents on the dollar competing against the big new systems that Boeing and Lockheed were bringing out. So you always got to remember these vested interests inside, and it doesn't mean these people are evil. It just means that you have a business interest and you have to take care of your stockholders. And if something is coming out that is going to influence your stock, whether you really believe it or not, you're going to try to stop it.
One thing that Hal mentioned too that I thought made sense was he was talking about how this whole AATIP program might have functioned on the 22 million. He was saying that that just went towards salaries. And I heard before in an interview too, I think it was George Knapp, where they were talking about this AATIP program could have functioned on that 22 million because they kind of piggybacked off old programs. So that money just went to salary. They just used old computers or previous tech and gear from other programs that may have existed. Do you think that the whole AATIP program could have functioned and it was just kind of Luis Elizondo and a couple of guys doing data mining?
Well, I think Eric pointed out in the interview that a lot of it was an analytical. It wasn't really that they were building, crafts and doing all this kind of stuff. It was more of an analytical type thing. And the other thing, if you remember in the interview, I think it was Hal, don't quote me, but I think it was Hal who mentioned that the CIA and other people were working on the material as well. It wasn't just the AATIP program that was working. There was other agencies, and so it sounded like it was bigger than just that program. But again, you hear this thing that is talked by a lot of people in the Delonge camp about these programs where they're sort of one guy's doing one thing, one guy's doing another thing. So I think they called it stovepipes, these various stovepipes that aren't really connected, that you probably had, and some people have said that probably every department had a program like this, and this is the only one that's sort of been exposed. But the way I understood it from whether it was Eric or Hal was that this was just more sort of an analytical program where they were doing analysis and theory, and they were gathering material and stuff like that. But it wasn't really a program where they were actually building anything. So I don't think it would have required all that much money. It would more like the paperwork. And I think it was actually Hal said the ones that require the big money programs, the big defense programs, is where you actually have to build things and you have to get infrastructure and all this kind of stuff.
So we got Eric Davis now coming forward, Hal Puthoff coming forward. Let's change gears a bit here and talk about Gary Nolan recently, talking to Whitley Strieber, another guy that's said some interesting things. Maybe we can go over that.
Yeah. Okay.
Talking about keeps going on about this nonverbal communication transmitted from entities and how it may intersect with remote viewing. And how it comes from the over there and the antennas. Like, what is this guy talking about? Like, holy crap, like, what are these guys looking into? And if this is the case, and we have legitimate scientists, like super brains like this guy, looking into this, I mean, what does that spell for, you know, the future and the study of the phenomenon in years to come? Like, it's going to get pretty intense, I think.
Yeah. Well, what I say is that people who look at this realize that these are guys who are legitimately trying to figure out what's going on. So you have, you know, the theoretical papers that Eric was putting out on, you know, warp drive and all this kind of stuff, all these kind of things. You have them gathering the metals and trying to analyze it. And most people are sort of missing the parts of the story, because a lot of people are basically sort of in awe of the video. Everybody just talks about the video. Oh, do you see that video? And, you know, problems with the video, and it's so cool and all this kind of stuff. And they miss the whole story of what's going on in the background. The one I say is the most important is the whole deal with the experiencers, that the fact that they're working with these experiencers. And they've talked to a number of people. They've actually leaked this stuff to Annie Jacobson. Had the story. There was a guy named Ryan Dube, who was at or Dube or Dubé, who was Kit Green went and talked to. I had a friend who Kit had told some stuff about this, and then it's leaked to the New York Times. And this is this idea that they're working with experiencers, and to me, that's much more important, much more. Gives you many more answers than the film. The film is, you know, it's kind of interesting, but they actually have a program where, yeah, I think it started with, and this is the way I heard the story, right or wrong, is that if you have 2% experiencers in the general public, you have 2% experiencers inside the federal government. And Kit Green used to be a CIA guy, ran the Weird Desk, which now they claim is called the Vault. And now he left in '83, and he was under contract, so he still does work for the CIA from time to time. One of the jobs that apparently he was given was, if you're inside the government and you start talking about having dreams with aliens in your room and all this kind of stuff, they send you to Kit Green. And Kit Green determines, are you crazy? Because he's a physiologist. He's good with brain scans and all this kind of stuff. So he determines, are you crazy or are you an experiencer? And during this program, he ran up against, at first I heard this a couple years ago, he had 50 people who had these, had been injured or had some sort of effect, physical effect from a UFO. So that's what they're basically looking for. If you're a scientist, you're looking for something that's actually quantitative or qualitative, where you can actually measure. It's not an anecdotal story that Matt had a UFO sighting and he thinks he was on top of a flying saucer and all this kind of stuff. These are people who actually have something that you can actually measure. So what they did in this program, and the program is run, and it was I think it was part of the AATIP program, and it may now be funded by the new AATIP program, because if you remember, Lou Elizondo said they got new financing in 2013. The program continues, so they've still got money. The money's coming in from somewhere. It didn't shut down in 2012, as the story goes. And this may be the money that's financing this program, or it may be coming from Bigelow. I'm not sure where the money's coming from. But they are running this program where they are taking experiencers, and they're looking at people who are highly psychic. So I heard that they had done Joe McMonagle's DNA, Uri Geller, Ingo Swann, all these type of people. They had looked at them, highly psychic people, and they had looked at experiencers to try to determine, is there a genetic marker? Is there a genetic difference between those people and ordinary people? Why are people like Chris Bledsoe and Betty and Barney Hill or John Burroughs or all these people, why are these people having these interactions with UFOs? Is it coincidence? Is it random? Or do these people have some sort of marker or antenna? And so what they look at DNA, they look at because Gary Nolan is the sort of the DNA expert on the program. Kit Green is the neurologist working on the program, and Hal Puthoff's on the program. And there's a senior engineer works for Hal who's also working on this program. So what they do is they look at the experiencer, why the injury, why are these injuries happening? What is it coming from? And this idea is marker. Is there a DNA marker in the people's background? Because what Gary Nolan from Stanford says is that now we have a situation with DNA that you can actually look at a person's DNA and you can actually see markers. The person had the flu, the person had a cold, that all this stuff is marked. It's all, you can actually go back in DNA and see these traumas in the DNA. So they've looked at this. And then, of course, they do the brain scans. And that's where it gets interesting, because that's what Kit Green is doing. And this is what Gary Nolan had said, was that he called it the antenna. He said all these people have a brain pattern that looks like an antenna. And this is the whole key. So if you're an experiencer, if you're a highly psychic person, or like maybe even like Desta, where you are pulling in stuff from the outside, you're getting this material. So it's not coincidence, it's not random that these people are having interactions with UFOs. It's because they have this brain pattern, this antenna pattern, that is actually sending out a signal, sending and receiving, and they're actually able to contact the others, or the UFOs, or whatever you want to call them. And that's the research they're doing. And I think that's extremely interesting research. And there's a tape that's actually leaked now, which I guess eventually maybe we'll put some of it out, or bits and pieces. But it's an actual tape which shows that they've gone one step farther. So you have these people who are having the experiences. They've got the brain pattern. They're able to tap in. But they actually now they actually use intuitives. So they give these people who are in the program, say 001, 002, 003. They name these people. Then they use intuitives. And they say to the intuitive, okay, here's your target 001. Tell us about this person. And according to Kit Green, I believe, who was on the tape, talking to this intuitive, the information that they were getting was 95% accurate. And so the intuitive is going back and saying, okay, this person's interacting with this type of alien. There's this underwater base. And that we're interfering with this base and picking up this kind of stuff. So they've actually gone one step farther, and they're doing almost like leading edge, almost like DARPA type material, taking science fiction and making it fact. So even though it may be sort of out on the edge, nobody wants to believe this stuff, they're running on the very edge of science to try to figure out, can we figure out what this is? Because if you remember, Hal Puthoff mentioned this thing about the Russians working on the program. Senator Reid mentioned this thing about the Russians working on the program, and it still comes down to this thing that if you're in this program, if you're Kit Green or Nolan or the Defense Department or the CIA or whatever, you're not only trying to figure out what this is because it may be a threat from evil aliens, you're also in this game because you know that the Russians and the Chinese are working on this thing, and whoever gets this technology rules the world. Because you know, if you listen to the experiencers, that all aliens are basically telepathic, and they can talk in your head, and they can basically block your memory, and they can do all this kind of stuff. So if you're an intelligence service, that's something you really want to be able to control. And that's why I say that's the most important part, and I think that's the most important part to them. That's what they're interested in, is this whole consciousness aspect. Not so much the video, not so much the hardware or whatever. It's the experiencers who are interacting with what they call the others, and who are actually able to show these mental abilities that if you could develop this kind of stuff, you will rule the world. Plus, we also know, and Jacques Sarfati actually brought this up in an email that I saw maybe a week ago, talking about this meeting that's rumored taking place in the next couple of days in the Bohemian Grove, where they're bringing this metal in. And this is this layered metal that Tom DeLonge has talked about. People are going to bring this layered metal in that we cannot build. That we have no technology to build this metal where it's like, as thin as a hair, and it's layered in layers, stuff like that. And at that point, Jacques Sarfati actually indicates that the mind may be used to fly the ship, and that the ship may be alive. Now, that's something experiencers have been saying for many years, and the significance of that is that Jacques Sarfati, if you followed him, has, like Hal Puthoff, been on the leading edge of UFO physics for probably 40 or 50 years. He's been working on the zero-point energy. He believes he understands the physics of how this whole thing operates, and they're trying to figure out the physics of the whole thing. And for Jacques Sarfati to say that mental phenomena may be involved in flying the craft, that's extremely important. So that ties into this experiencer thing, because the only people that you're going to be able to figure that out is by watching the experiencers.
One thing he also mentioned too was he dropped terms like savantism and the relationship to remote viewing. You know, talking about this antenna thing. I think this part of the story we really need to follow, and I think this is another key aspect to it.
I wrote a book called Inspired, which goes down this rabbit hole. And what I say is that if you look at, and I'm pretty sure that when Ron Pandolfi first encountered Dan Smith in 1991, I think it was in the second conversation, he said to Dan Smith, he said, "We have a phenomenology problem." And so that's the word I believe that's used. That's the word I think is accurate, is it's phenomenology. If you listen to John Alexander, he'll talk about this. You talk to Jim Semivan, he'll basically mention this whole thing, is that consciousness may be the underlying factor of this whole thing. So I wrote this book called Inspired, where I basically point out that it's all the same thing. And that's what I believe they believe, is that, so if you're looking at the weird desk, you're looking at UFOs, you're looking at remote viewing, you're looking at near-death experiences, and that's what the Free Foundation, Ray Hernandez, who was one of the co-founders of the Free Foundation, had a download experience where he was shown this wheel that was spinning, and the beings were showing him this wheel, and on the wheel it was all marked. And you had remote viewing and psychic phenomena, near-death experiences and UFOs and all this kind of stuff. And it was the same idea, that we're parsing all this stuff. We're saying channelers are one thing, and then there's experiencers, and then there's remote viewing and all sorts of stuff. And we're saying there's separate phenomena. They're all the same phenomena. They're this underlying phenomenology consciousness thing. So when I wrote the book called Inspired, I went through all the different chapters, and I look at all the different chapters. So I did near-death experiences, I did UFOs, and I did savants. And savants is the same sort of thing. So you have a great number of savants have left brain damage, and that's your rational, analytical brain that, sort of stops you from being hypnotized, that, is always getting in the way, the little voice that's talking and stuff. And what I basically said is that's what it comes down to, is can you disassociate? Can you shut down the left brain? And once you can shut down the left brain, whether it's through hypnosis or psychedelics or through meditation or whatever it is, once you can, then you can pop out. You can disassociate, and you can pop into this field where all the information is. And that's all like a medium. The story was that a great number of mediums, have childhood abuse issues. And that would make sense, that if you're a child and you have this abuse issue and you're being abused, you're trying to cut yourself off from the physical world. You're trying to separate yourself from the physical world. And the next thing you know, you've disassociated and you've popped out and you're talking to your dead grandmother or something like that. So that's the key thing, is it's all sort of linked into this, this phenomenology, into the fact that we have the physical world, but beyond the physical world, as quantum physics is showing, it's much more complex than just little atoms and nuts and bolts and stuff like that. And I think they realize it. So you get John Alexander talking about consciousness. You got the Canadian government in 1950 talking about consciousness. You got Bob Bigelow, who puts up $3.7 million to the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, for consciousness studies. They all know that there's this underlying consciousness thing that may be the key to this whole mystery.
That's amazing. We see all sorts of videos coming out now talking about simulated reality and quantum physics. It kind of looks like we're moving that way. Well, I have one last question, and it's a little off topic maybe, but why do you think they avoid the term alien? Do you think that it might be something bigger? Is it they don't want the ridicule? What do you think?
No, I'm pretty sure I know what that is. I mean, this is my guess, but I'm pretty sure. If you listen, and these are some of these interviews that I went back to listen to. The one is from Bob Bigelow, 2013, is done with George Knapp. And you got to remember, Bigelow basically is running from 2007 on. He has all the data. He has all the FAA files. He has all the MUFON files, all the Canadian files. He has, the Carpenter files. He has, all the hardware that's been brought since 2007, all these documents, and he basically controls everything. So what he says is extremely important. You should listen to him very carefully. And what he said in 2013, George Knapp asks him the question. George says to him, "Do you believe are you in favor of disclosure?" And Bob Bigelow says, "No, I'm not." He says, "What we need is confirmation. That's what we need. What we need to do is to get to the public the fact that this thing's for real, that there's something out there. To know aliens, dead body, they don't need to drop all the rest of that stuff on them. All they need to know is, yes, this phenomena is real. You stop right there, and in a number of years, disclosure comes a number of years down the road. It's a much more complex issue about what's actually going on, who's behind the phenomena. But he says first you get confirmation, and then a number of years later, then you move to disclosure. Now you got to remember, he controls all the material. So I think in terms of what To the Stars is doing is going to be a lot influenced by Bob Bigelow, because he's a key player. He's got all the material. He's the kingpin in this whole thing. So I think this would be part of what Bob Bigelow would have put in, which is the idea that on December 16th, we drop this thing in the New York Times, and we basically say, well, we should have said in 1947, we have this mysterious phenomena. Something's going on. We don't know what it is, but we're studying it. Instead of saying, no, there's nothing going on, there's no national security threat and all this kind of stuff, and start all over again, and you do what they did. And that's confirmation. What happened on December 16th is confirmation. So you say, we have a phenomena, we're looking at this phenomena, we really don't know what it is, and stop right there. Don't bring up aliens. So none of them are talking about aliens, and I think that's by purpose, is don't bring up the aliens, don't bring up crash saucers, don't bring up this, don't bring up that. They don't need to know that. We're just going to take first step, we'll go there, then we'll do another step, then we'll do another step, because that was what the Brookings Institute report showed in the 1960s. And according to, I'm not sure where Bob Bigelow said this, but I think Bob said there was a couple of other think tanks who had come to the same conclusion, is you cannot drop this thing on people. You cannot go the whole thing and say, okay, these aliens from here, they're doing this, they're doing that, we had crash saucers, they're mutilating cattle, they're doing this, they're doing that. No, you stop right at the beginning. You keep the alien thing out of it. All you say is, we've got a phenomena. We're studying the phenomena. It's very interesting. The government knows about this. And what they've done, in my opinion, is they have moved this into private industry. Because what they want to do is, the government never wants to do it. If you remember back a story that was told by Stephen Greer, he claimed to have gotten a briefing papers, and I saw them in the Clinton Library. These briefing papers, there's maybe 600 pages, all sorts of documents and a briefing text and stuff like that. And he had given it to Clinton. The library said Bill Clinton didn't read it. But, there was what was called an FOB, a friend of Bill, who came back out of the White House to Stephen Greer and said, the president has read your stuff, and his reply to you is, I can't do it, but you can. And so what I think is going on here with the private industry, why this thing has been moved into the private industry to Bob Bigelow, and why they say we can't do it, you can, is they want private industry to make the disclosure. They don't want the government to say, okay, we did this, we did that, we're making the disclosure. So what they do is as we watch, they're moving this stuff into private industry, and it's going to be private industry that is going to make the disclosure. So basically you have Jim Semivan, you have Elizondo, you have Steve Justice, you have Mellon, you have all these guys who are all retired. They are not government. They are maybe black ops, contractors, but they are not the government, and they are going to do the disclosure. So take the heat off the government. It's going to be private industry that's going to make the disclosure. They've got the hardware. They're going to bring out the hardware, and it moves it away from the government. That was always the thing. The same as when Hillary Clinton. Take a look at what happened with Hillary Clinton. John Podesta comes out and says to Lena Dunham in September of 2015, the next time you interview Hillary, ask her about the aliens. So why did Hillary not bring up the aliens? She was running. She could have brought up the aliens. She could have brought up the UFO subject. She never brought it up one single time. Everybody thinks she did. She didn't. She just answered 3 questions. The idea is they want us to do it. They want us to force the disclosure. They want us to make the move and move the government out from the responsibility of this whole thing. That's why they're moving to private industry, and that's what I think they're, in my personal opinion, that's what I think they're going to do. They're going to move so much material into the private industry that it'll be Bob Bigelow, Jim Semivan, Tom DeLonge, Mellon, Justice. These are the guys that will do the disclosure, and it will take the heat off the government.
Grant, that's amazing. You're just a whirlwind of information, always such a knowledgeable guy. Grant, I've been listening to you for quite a while now, and I've always been really impressed. Everything you say, you can go and look up, you can vet it, you can check it out, it can be researched. you don't speculate all that much, and I really respect that, Grant. I think you're one of the best researchers out there, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to chat with you tonight, man. It's been great. I look forward to doing another interview with you again soon, and looking forward to that new book you got coming out, man. Music in the Paranormal is going to be neat.
Yeah, and just to give you a little hint that something is coming, when I shut off here, we're going to do an interview, and we are going to get some clarification. Somebody has contacted us. They say we've got some stuff wrong, and we're going to get some clarification on, and we will clear up. There's some things apparently I've got wrong, and I'm going to do an interview shortly, and we're going to find out what we got wrong, and we're going to put it out there and clarify some of the things that I've gotten wrong. But we are getting help, and I think that's what people got to realize. People always have the idea, and I sort of disagree with it, that you've got a bunch of evil people in the government who are trying to destroy the world. And I say there are people, a lot of them are experiencers, a lot of them are people who are very interested in this phenomena, and they are just like you and I trying to get the story out. And I think we're getting help in getting this story out. So we'll do that interview, and it probably won't be out for a couple of weeks. We want to hold it back for a couple of weeks. But it should be very revealing. I'm very surprised at the move, that this action that happened this afternoon. So just to give people a hint that something's coming.
Right on. Nice teaser, Grant. Great.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here scratching my head. Oh my goodness. Thanks, Grant.
Okay.
Grant, have a good night. I appreciate it, man.
Okay. Thanks.